going to talk about mostly paperwork, so this is definitely going to be the most exciting topic of the next couple of days, talking about the Task Force Leader Guidebook and the packet that you get when you check into an incident. And we're going to also talk a little bit about the mobilization plan and how we end up at incidents to begin with, because I don't know if you guys always get to hear about how we get there or how we don't get there. And then we'll talk about basic task force leader stuff. How do you assemble and depart? Checking in when you get there, the forms and the paperwork, and then the Demob process, and specifically how task force leaders can help drive this process and make everything successful for everybody. So basically the state is divided into fire defense districts, and that's mostly done by county. So each county would have a fire defense board chief, and that fire defense board chief is responsible for knowing all of the resources in their county. So who's available to go on deployments, how many task force leaders do we have, how many Type 6 engines, how do we mobilize everybody. So when we have a large incident, the local chief would work with the deputy state fire marshal and their fire defense board chief to request assistance, and there's a 3-page form that you fill out to request a conflagration. That usually comes to our chief deputy or sometimes the state fire marshal, depending on who's available. And then based on a few factors we'll talk about in a minute, that goes to the governor, asking her to, or him, to implement the Conflagration Act. And then from there, our office mobilizes resources. So something to note is that the MOB plan can be used separately from the Conflagration Act. So when we have teams responding to like the Vernonia flood or line of duty deaths or the UCC shooting or things like that, we are able to mobilize people that way, but there's nothing built in for us to reimburse you. So that's why those are voluntary deployments for the most part. Although I do think we paid for Vernonia. So important considerations when the request for conflagration comes in. The main thing is the type of property or lives that are threatened. The main thing that we're doing is protecting structures. That's mostly what our resources are doing. So if there aren't any structures immediately threatened or imminently threatened, then most likely the request for conflagration would be denied, and that definitely does happen. Or sometimes they look at what's going on and say, well, in 24 hours we might need to be there, and so we deploy early and then it starts raining. So the Delegation of Authority, they talked a little bit about that this morning. The incident commander actually is the one to complete the Delegation of Authority, so I think it's kind of a common misconception that the State Fire Marshal's office is the one in control of an incident. That's not really the case. The IC is the one in control of an incident and responsible for all of the decisions that are being made. So that delegation is generally with the local fire chief, but if you're outside of a fire jurisdiction, it might be with a county commissioner or someone else. They specify the terms and scope of the delegation. So some of the things they talk about is like integrating our team in with a team that's already there, or if the local fire chief wants to have certain roles and responsibilities that he keeps. But for the most part, the team comes in, and the team and the resources the team is controlling take responsibility for the entire jurisdiction, and that can include initial attack. And then I have media approval there because that, like they mentioned earlier, that was actually part of a delegation last summer, was that no media would be released without the BIA having approval of it beforehand. So there's lots of things in the delegation that should probably be communicated better, and that's one of the things we're all working on at the team level, is to make sure that you guys, the boots on the ground, know what our box is and that we're working inside of it. Because I think sometimes there are operational needs and we'll go outside of the area we have delegation for. So it's important that we share that information with you all. So the process for sending them, once the conflagration has been approved, the State Fire Marshal activates the AOC. The AOC is staffed by Office of State Fire Marshal staff, and they also activate the incident management teams. The incident management teams have a conference call with the local chief to determine the initial resources that we'll request. And that's important for you all to know, because sometimes our AOC staff get questions like, why are we sending Type 1s? Because that's what the local chief asked for. And our AOC doesn't have any authority or ability to send Type 6s, even though that's probably what we want. So we get a lot of questions like that, and those decisions aren't actually made in the AOC, they're made on the ground. So then the AOC starts contacting the Fire Defense Board chiefs with the specific resource request. And then you guys all get contacted. And then you send in the form that we'll talk about in a minute, and hopefully the AOC says your form is good and you're good to go. So when you're deciding which people you want to deploy, it's important to think about training. We used to say you had to be certified through DPSST, and we're moving a little bit away from that this year in that you just have to meet the NWCG 310-1 requirements, which are the same as DPSST's requirements. It's just the difference between having a pile of certs versus having the cert from DPSST that says, Division Group Supervisor. It's also important to know how your equipment is typed. So we use NIMS standards, which is the National Incident Management System. It's the FEMA typing standards. And there are not NIMS standards for certain things like Type 6 engines and other wildland-specific equipment. So we use NWCG standards there. And all this is in the MOB plan. And then Type 1 and 2 engines need SCBAs and PPE, and you always want to make sure you have off-road or improved unpaved road capable tires. So that was one thing that came up last year, was a lot of folks were sending out command vehicles with, street tires, and that became a pretty expensive problem and pretty time-consuming issue, especially at Canyon Creek. And then you always want to make sure you have 72 hours worth of food and water for everybody, sleeping bags, clothing, it seems obvious, but I think in the rush to get out the door, people forget, to bring medication and food and things that you need with you. All right, so when the request is initially made, the ideal time is 20 minutes, yes or no. So the AOC calls the Fire Defense Board chief, and our goal is that within 20 minutes, your Fire Defense Board chief can say, yes, we'll fill that, or no, we can't fill that, and then we can move on. And then we'd like you to be on the road within an hour and a half. And that's definitely a tight time frame, but a lot of counties do it consistently. And then IMT members are under similar expectations. So just having all your stuff ready and having a plan beforehand can make this go so much faster and so much easier. So this form is a little bit different than it has been in years past. On the top there, the AOC is going to be completing this and sending it to you with the request, so you'll actually know the name of the fire you're going to, where you're going, when we would like you to be there, and we'll be giving out order numbers this year, so that's new as well. And then the Task Force Strike Team Identifier. So in years past, it's always been like Task Force 1, Task Force 2, Task Force 3, and then at the next fire, Task Force 1, Task Force 2, Task Force 3. But this year, we're just going to start at 1 and keep going. Hopefully that will alleviate some confusion, because like if you got moved from one fire, you might be Task Force 5 on this fire, and then you get to the next fire, and now you're Task Force 8. So there was a lot of confusion when we had the 3 fires at once last year. So we're hoping to alleviate that by your task force gets a number, and that's your number until you're back home. The AOC should be filling out that top portion and sending it to either the task force leader or the Fire Defense Board chief, whoever is assembling the resources, and then they fill out that bottom portion. So where are you from? Who are we talking to? Who are you mobilizing? And your engine types. One of the more important things that people miss a lot is listing the additional departments that are responding. So if you have a department that's on the very bottom, so if you have a department that's not sending an apparatus, but it's sending personnel, you want to put their name on the bottom there, because otherwise we don't know to send them a reimbursement packet. All of this paperwork stuff really, it's all very important to the incident, but it all kind of revolves around making sure everybody gets paid in a timely manner and appropriately. Once you submit that back to the AOC, you're still not ready to go. You have to wait for the AOC to say, yes, your paperwork is good, everything looks right, you have the correct numbers. And then another thing that's being added to the MOB plan this year is automatic approval of an assistant task force leader and a support rig. So in years past, people have always asked, and we've always said yes, but I think people felt like they had to make a special request and that the AOC might say no, but so we're just adding that language to the MOB plan to make it clear that everyone can take an assistant or trainee task force leader, and every task force can have one support vehicle. And then I added no negotiations, please, because again, our AOC staff are just State Fire Marshal's office staff. Some of them have never been in that room before. Some of them have never looked at the MOB plan, and their jobs are very different than mine, so if you say, well, I don't have a type 1, but I have a type 3, that really doesn't mean anything to them. And then they start calling the IC, and then the IC is calling the agency rep, and it's difficult. So if you don't have what they're asking for, it's better to just tell them, no, I don't have that. Next form. The next form, and this is new to a lot of you guys this year, is the resource manifest. So I think you all picked one of these up when you came in. Last year, the incident management teams and a couple of counties sort of piloted this. And this year, we're trying to make it official. So it replaces the FSPO1. You guys all remember the hard card that tears in half when you don't want it to. Similar to the FSPO1, every form or every apparatus needs to have one form. And the most important thing for you guys is to make sure you're recording your times, your time of departure especially. When you get there, the resource unit leader is actually going to take it from you. With the FSPO ones, you kept them and recorded your actions and whatnot. And then a few years ago, we asked that you stop recording your actions on the FSPO1, and we started giving you 214s. So this year, we'll just take this from you, and then you can fill out 214s. And I think we'll talk a little bit about 214s in a minute, but it's definitely a little bit different because this is your paycheck, and I know a lot of you guys are used to holding on to your paycheck and making sure you have it the whole time, but us resource unit leaders will make sure that we keep it safe. So the question was, if you have multiple departments on one rig, should we have multiple manifests? And the answer is no. We want one manifest per apparatus. And last year when we were piloting that, we tried it both ways, and it's definitely less confusing for the team if there's one form for every rig. That's a good question. The last column on the right is home agency, so everybody on your rig should be able to go on this one form. That might be a little bit more when you get back. You have to make sure the other department has a copy of it or whatever, but it definitely is going to reduce confusion in the field and reduce duplication of paperwork. Prior to check-in, you want to fuel prior to arrival, and that is not a reimbursable expense, and I know that that's not popular, but that's just the way that it's written. So we pay what's called a wet rate, and that includes fuel and equipment and everything that makes your apparatus an apparatus. So fuel to and from the incident is not reimbursable, and you should always arrive ready to go on the line. As I'm sure many of you can attest to, sometimes we need you on the line 10 minutes ago. So when you arrive, you want to contact the AOC and let them know you're there, and then you want to check in with the structural resource unit leader. You will give them your apparatus forms, which is the form that says which engines you're bringing and what equipment is on them, and those are all available in the Task Force Leader Guidebook. And then you'll give us your manifests, and we will give you the packets that you received when you check in. So we've been doing that for a couple years now, so that way you don't have to bring all of this stuff with you. And inside the packets, you'll find a copy of the Task Force Strike Team Leader Guidebook, 7 Demob forms, 6 evaluation forms, 6 unit logs, and an after-action review form. And we do have the unit log books that we got last year, so you might be receiving those books instead of the 214 individual 214s. Within the Task Force Strike Team Leader Guidebook, you will find checklists, forms, the comm plan, and resource typing information. So as strike team leaders, you guys probably all want to be familiar with the contents of this guidebook prior to mobilizing. So the checklist, there's a checklist about how to make sure you have everybody ready to go. There's a checklist about how you check in, and there's a checklist for everything you need to do prior to demob. And then there's all these forms that we'll talk about in a minute, and a comm plan, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and then resource typing stuff, which I think you're all pretty familiar with. All right, so more about the individual forms. The 212 demob form, it's kind of a long form with a bunch of things on it, like windshield wipers working, battery operational, and so, you know, every engine needs to complete that prior to demob, and then our safety officer just signs off and makes sure that you completed the form and that everything looks good. And then evaluations, which you're all familiar with as well, 1 form per apparatus, and the task force leader, the task force as a whole, receives an evaluation from your div soup. The ICS 214 unit log, 1 per apparatus per operational period. Those are given to your div soup. Your div soup reads every single one of them, gives them to their ops section chief, who reads every single one of them, who gives them to either the IC or to plans, and we read every single one of them. And I know they're going to talk a little bit more about the 214s later today, but 214s, I think it's easy to not fill them out or to fill them out to a fault. And it's just important to remember that that's how our office gets information about what happened during any given operational period. So if there's something strange or we see like a weird claim or something, we should be able to go to your 214 and find out what happened, where did these claims come from, etc. And also the 214 is a legal document, so a lot of the documentation you guys are filling out become legal documents and they're part of the official doc box, and if we get a request for information, we have to give that out to like the media or whoever asks for it. So that's just another thing to consider when you're filling out your 214. So the last thing that comes in the packet is the task force after action form. So this is new for 2016. My office always does after actions for every fire, but they're definitely IMT focused because that's where all of our information comes from. So we're hoping that by asking the task forces to do little after actions as well, that we can actually make this better for the crews on the ground as well, because it's not about the teams, it's really about you guys. You guys are the ones doing the work. So we just ask that 20 minutes at a minimum. I know there's often a lot more to talk about than that, and we hope we can build more time in, but at least 20 minutes, what was planned, what happened, why, and what will we do differently, or what would we do next time. So the form itself, which is in the packet, actually has an example on the back, and thanks to Chief Mentor for giving me a really awesome example. So that's really what we're hoping for. We're hoping for very specific information about how operations were, how it was working with the team, how it was mobilizing with your group. You know, how can my office make this a better experience and a safer experience for everybody? So that's new. Demob, you want to be ready per the Demob plan. So as Ron said, if you're on time, you're late. So if it says that you will be meeting with the resource unit leader and demobbing at 0700, you should be fed, you should have fuel, you should maybe have your weed wash done if that's a thing they're doing at that fire. You should be ready to go. A lot of times we check people out and then a couple hours later we see you in line for breakfast, and it's a very expensive thing to mobilize you all, and I know it's not all about money, but for me, who has to pay all the bills, I see dollar signs when that happens. So you want to make sure you turn in your radios and all other borrowed equipment. That's the thing. I think people get excited to leave and they forget to turn in stuff they might have borrowed from the cache, like PPE. Safety collects your 212. The resource unit leader collects your evaluations and your after action. The resource unit leader signs your manifest with the time and gives it back to you. Generally, the IC or agency rep is going to address the group, give a rah and a thank you for being there. And then when you leave, you want to call the AOC. So the AOC's main job is to track you when you're traveling. So the AOC cares when you leave your point of departure and when you get to the incident, and they care again when you leave the incident and when you get back home. So that's hugely important. And then when you get home, you want to call your Fire Defense Board chief and let them know that you're back. The Fire Defense Board chief calls our AOC when everyone's home, so we know when everybody's made it home safely. So if you don't call them, they don't call us, and then we start calling people at 2 o'clock in the morning. So a little bit about how you guys can help the reimbursement process. So as the person who does the packets, 270 of them this year, it can be a time-consuming and painful process. And you guys can actually help make this a lot easier by calling the AOC and by writing the time that you call the AOC. If you call the AOC at 10:45, put 10:45. Don't put 11, don't put 10:30. It just makes it so much easier for everyone. Call the Fire Defense Board chief, like I said, when you get back in station. Those times are very important. Those are the times, they're your start time and your end time. So the people who I'm working with to complete this paperwork often really know very little about your response. So if those two times are right on your manifest, the billing process is super ridiculously easy. If they're wrong, it's very painful. Make sure whoever is going to do your billing has all of the documents they're going to need. So if you have claims, you want to make sure they have that information. You want to make sure they have your manifest. And if you've purchased any reimbursable items, which you probably haven't, you want to make sure that they have those receipts. And then don't be surprised if myself or someone else in my office contacts you and says, hey, why did you purchase gas outside of the incident, or something like that. And don't be afraid to answer those questions. Yeah, we have to be really strict with the little things like fuel to and from an incident so that we can keep paying the things that really matter, like portal-to-portal pay. Okay, thank you all so much for being here. Have a good time.